Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. Kenneth Roth is the former Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. He has extensively investigated human rights abuses around the world, focusing especially on the world's most dire situations, the pursuit of international justice, the major powers' foreign policies, the work of the United Nations, and the global contest between democracy and autocracy. He's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and other major publications. In 3 decades under the leadership of Kenneth Roth, Human Rights Watch conducted investigations in 100 countries to uncover abuses and pressured offending governments to stop them. Having covered Kenneth Roth's recent book, Righting Wrongs, on the Activist Lawyer Book Club, and having followed reports and publications of Human Rights Watch as part of my career in law for many, many years, it is my absolute pleasure that Kenneth joins us today on the Activist Lawyer podcast to talk both about his book, which is really worth reading, and we'll share links to the book afterwards, and also about his career and his opinion and impression of what is happening in the world right now. So I thoroughly enjoyed interviewing Kenneth about his career, and I hope you enjoy listening to today's recording. And please, of course, review and share it as much as possible. I am very happy to welcome Mr. Kenneth Roth to the Activist Lawyer podcast. Thank you for joining me.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Sarah.
I know you're joining me all the way from New York, which is a lot hotter than it is here in the north of Ireland today, although it's a bit hot for me.
Yes, you have nothing to complain about. Yes.
That is true. Well, look, we've a lot to talk about. And as said, it's great to have you here because we recently discussed your book, Righting Wrongs, in the Activist Lawyer Book Club, which we will get to in the course of our conversation. But first, if you didn't mind taking us back in time a little bit and telling us about your career, your commitment to human rights spans almost 4 decades. And I'm wondering what the moment was when you decided that this would be your life's work.
Well, I'm not sure there was a single moment, but there were, a variety of things that influenced me. A big part was really just growing up, because my father fled Nazi Germany as a 12-year-old boy to come to the United States. And so I grew up, hearing Hitler stories. I heard what it was like to be, a young Jewish boy worried about being beaten up by the brown shirts at the schoolyard, worrying that his father, my grandfather, would be arrested. So I became very aware of the evil that governments could do. And that was a big part of what pushed me to try to avoid that. But it was also, frankly, I was in law school when Jimmy Carter was the U.S. president, and he introduced human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy. And I knew I wanted to devote myself as a lawyer to rights. That's really why I went to become a lawyer. But I found the international domain, the new frontier, very interesting. And so I tried to, move in that direction. It was not the smartest move at the time because there was very little of a human rights movement. I signed up for the one human rights course offered at my law school and they canceled it. So to this day, I've never taken a human rights course. I teach 2, but I've never taken one. And I went into a non-existent job market. Human Rights Watch at that stage had 2 employees. So I really started off as a volunteer. I worked as a lawyer, days, and then spent nights and weekends volunteering. And after 6 years of that, a job opened up at Human Rights Watch and I jumped at it.
Brilliant. Well, it's a big change from how you started your career, which was as a federal prosecutor. Did that work feed into how you worked in the human rights sector at all? How long did you do that for?
I was a federal prosecutor for 4.5 years, mainly in New York City. And what I really learned from that, and really more broadly from my more traditional legal career, was the importance of facts. Because when you're a litigator, yes, you work within the law, you cite the law, but what really moves people is facts. Yeah. And I try to bring that same understanding to the defense of international human rights, because Human Rights Watch, actually doesn't litigate. We're not a litigation organization. Other people do that. We investigate, report on, and expose facts that governments would rather keep hidden, but that reveal their disregard for human rights. And that is, very shameful. It's delegitimizing, but it also, can move public opinion. And so that, for me, was what I brought from my background as a prosecutor and as a litigator, briefly, is that it's really facts that speak much more loudly than the law in terms of building public opinion and ultimately public pressure on governments to respect rights.
Sure. Well, you mentioned briefly how you started to work in the global human rights movement and Human Rights Watch itself. I mean, I worked in refugee law for a long time as a solicitor in Dublin, so I'm very familiar with the country reports that your organisation would have generated. But it really evolved, as you said, from a very, very small team to a real global force. And you stepped down recently from the organisation after nearly 3 decades. But I'm wondering how you saw the organisation's goals and methods evolve during that time.
Well, I mean, it was obviously a big evolution. But I began by just trying to broaden the scope of what we did. So, I aim to ultimately have a researcher, an investigator for every country with serious human rights problems. And that was, a gradual process. You had to raise the money for it. I also, recognizing that the country researchers tended to be preoccupied with more traditional civil and political rights problems, whether it's, censorship or repression or wartime abuses. I recognized that there were certain categories of people who were falling through the cracks, and that if we were to address them, we had to build up specialized programs on women's rights, on children's rights, on LGBT rights, et cetera. And so I gradually did that over time. And then, the big evolution was in the scope of the organization's advocacy and communications work. Because at the beginning, Human Rights Watch was very much focused on Washington. We would try to get the US government to put pressure on the target government. And that became less viable, initially with the George W. Bush administration's war on terror. And when he's, torturing people and throwing them in Guantanamo, US credibility was diminished. So we, of necessity, had to globalize the advocacy and the communications work too. And that, again, was a gradual process, but it involved opening advocacy offices in key European capitals and then gradually around the world in influential centers of influence, wherever they might be.
And one of the tools that you mentioned in your book that helped advance your work is shaming. It's the first time I came across that. And I'm wondering, can you explain what this means and how it helped your organisation achieve its aims?
Well, in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. That's, a matter of their basic legitimacy. It's a way of saying, we're looking out for you, the people of our country, not just ourselves. And so they all, maintain that pretense. In fact, the reality is often, much more ugly. Yeah. And so if Human Rights Watch researchers can carefully investigate and document this discrepancy between pretense and practice, it is shameful. Mm-hmm. It tends to delegitimize the government. Now, governments hate that, especially because we were able to shine a very intense spotlight on that discrepancy. By the time I left Human Rights Watch, there was something like 1,000 media mentions every single day. So this was an intense spotlight. And governments would, typically attack us and say, oh, you misunderstood, you lied, you're biased, whatever. But we were super careful. And so we would welcome those battles over the facts because we would win them. And ultimately, governments recognized that they would not get rid of the bad press we were generating until they changed the bad conduct. And that's how we began to make progress.
Well, on the theme of evolution, I mean, human rights advocates, defenders, journalists, field workers, and so on are reporting and instantly sharing their work due to technology. And I mean, it's been said many times of late that we're watching a live genocide unfold on our own phones. So I'm interested in how technology evolved and how the digital media has, transformed and revolutionized many aspects of not just your work in Human Rights Watch, but also the advocacy that's referenced in the book as well. I know you cover this, but how have human rights campaigns changed due to technology, and what risks have been involved in that as well?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, Sarah. As I describe in the book, I think the evolution of the human rights movement can be understood in terms of the evolution of communications technology. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, when information traveled by steamship it was very slow. And you could only learn about things that were big, long-lasting things. If there was a massacre, it would take you, a month to find out about it. It was too late to do anything. Sure. So at the outset, the human rights movement focused on the slave trade, on women's suffrage, on things that were big, long-lasting problems. But as communication technology improved, the ability to address things more in real time evolved. And, at first it was still pretty slow. When Amnesty got started, they used letters. They would write letters, snail mail, because, international phone calls were super expensive. They would every once in a while travel, but a lot of it was by snail mail. And, that also was slow. Yeah. But when email emerged, that was revolutionary right there. In fact, Human Rights Watch shared a Nobel Peace Prize around our campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, and a campaign that we organized for the first time with email. And we were able to build a global campaign easily because it was, simple technology. Today, with smartphones, with social media, information travels really quickly. It's impossible for governments to hide things. Everybody's got a smartphone. Everybody takes a picture. They post it on social media. So that's the good news. It means that we can learn about things today and try to influence them tomorrow. We can communicate with journalists, with government officials who might help us very quickly. The downside, of course, is that the bad guys have this technology too. And so they can use social media to disseminate disinformation and propaganda because they no longer have to go through traditional journalists and editors who would try to filter out lies. They can just speak themselves. So that's the challenge, and how do you deal with the hatred and the disinformation on social media? I still think that this communications technology is a net plus for the human rights movement because it does help hold governments to account. But as so much of what I describe in the book, it's a battle. Yeah. And we have to just accept that it's a battle, and we have to fight back against the purveyors of hatred and lies.
Yeah, a double-edged sword, really. Well, look, on your book, Righting Wrongs, firstly, what inspired you to write it and why now?
Well, I was pushed to write it because when I would describe to people what I did, I would say, I defend human rights. They kind of have this look in their eye, isn't that nice? But you can't really do anything, can you? And it was sort of like a nice, well-intentioned, but ineffectual endeavor, many people assumed. And so what I wanted to do in writing the book is to show that actually the defense of human rights is a matter of hardball. Not only do we shame governments, which they hate, we also, try to prevent them from gaining access to international goods that they covet until they improve their human rights practices, whether that's arms sales or preferential trade benefits or invitations to fancy summits. So, we really try to change the cost-benefit analysis behind repression. And that is it's a fight. But I wanted to illustrate that fight, describe it in generic terms, but then provide a lot of examples of how it's waged, how we, don't always win, but sometimes we win and we make a big difference in people's lives. Mm-hmm.
Well, in your book, of course, you go through many examples, as you've just said, in many countries in the various chapters, all very different, of course. But I'm wondering, given, what we're witnessing today and the worrying, for want of a better word, state of the world, it's beyond words at this stage. What, in your opinion, how are the international mechanisms and the international institutions that we've so heavily relied on, are they fit for purpose, in your opinion, right now, given what we're witnessing?
I think they are what they are. I'm not sure they would be easy to improve upon them. The issue is more, how do we enlist them? How do we make sure that they work? Yeah. And so, if you take what Israel is doing in Gaza, arguably genocide, it's been, widely condemned by virtually every UN body but the Security Council, where the U.S. exercises its veto. The International Criminal Court has charged Netanyahu and the former defense minister Gallant. The International Court of Justice is considering a genocide case and has issued various, preliminary rulings to try to stop it. And so, the world has done a lot here. Yeah. The difficulty is that Netanyahu is really banking on the support of one person, and that's the U.S. president. Mm-hmm. And so long as, Biden and now Trump were providing arms and military aid, the Israelis just kept starving, and so I think that, that is the challenge. It doesn't mean that the system is wrong. It just means that we have to build up pressure on, in this case, the key actor, Trump, which is not easy to do because Trump, is notorious for breaching norms, for not really caring about human rights. But we do, I think, have a route to influence Trump in that, he doesn't want to be seen as naive. He wants to be seen as a master deal maker. And so if he sees that Netanyahu is playing him, that Netanyahu is just kind of trying to drag the U.S. in, kind of what just happened in
today,
that gives us an opportunity to push Trump to pressure Netanyahu. And the good news here is that Trump is in a better position to pressure Netanyahu than any other recent U.S. president, because there's nobody to the right of Trump.
Okay.
There's nobody to whom Netanyahu can turn within the U.S. political system and hope for support if he loses Trump. So I think that has to be our strategy. It's not easy, but I think it's doable.
Yeah. And I mean, I've read your writing recently. It's kind of off question, but just on Trump in terms of, his recent events in the United States. And I think you've written in an article that we might have seen kind of a halt on some of his kind of bigger activities. For example, how the concept of the rule of law and his absolute disdain for it, and how he has treated judges and lawyers who go against him. But how concerned are you that this kind of autocratic behaviour, which brings into focus the legal profession and the rule of law, I mean, should we be worried about this? Or is it something that you think will die away?
Oh, no, we should definitely be worried. Mm-hmm. It's something we really need to fight back against. But I don't think Trump is succeeding here. Mm-hmm. He clearly is pursuing the autocrat's handbook. Yeah. He's trying to attack the checks and balances on his power. And so that's what's behind the attacks on the law firms and the universities and civil society and the media, judges. These are all institutions that restrain him, and he's trying to stop that. But in fact, while some have acquiesced, notoriously Columbia University or a handful of law firms, CBS News, but many are resisting. And we've seen now, growing demonstrations. There have been over 200 court rulings stopping Trump in various aspects of what he's doing. And I mean, even in his area of greatest political strength, his deportation campaign, he's overreached. It turns out that what Americans wanted is to secure the border with Mexico. They didn't want these raids in neighborhoods where the people being picked up are long-term residents. They may not have papers, but they're basically Americans in every other respect. And, the U.S. public doesn't want people deported who have jobs and pay taxes and have families with U.S. citizens, spouses and kids. That's not what they had in mind. And so the fact that Trump is overreaching, which he's prone to do because he's surrounded himself with a bunch of sycophants, is fueling this reaction. And so I think this is, it's an important battle. It's one where I think we're making significant progress, but the U.S. presidency is a powerful position, so he'll still do a lot of harm. But we, I think, are making some progress in constraining him.
Interesting. Well, he's had in true form, he's had some choice words today for Iran and Israel, which is being broadcast around the world. But just going back to Righting Wrongs, your book, you recount both victories and difficult setbacks. Is there any personal experiences in your field that really stand out for you? I'm sure there are many, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose there are two sorts. I mean, on the one hand, there are some of these big global institutions that we help secure. I mean, I'm particularly proud of the role that Human Rights Watch played in building the International Criminal Court and fending off the U.S. government's effort to create an exception for Americans. That's not our idea of justice. Fortunately, that wasn't the world's idea of justice either. And, the U.S. lost at the final vote in Rome in 1998 by a vote of 120-7. So we won that, and that's the ICC today. Yeah. But, most of the things that we do have a much more concrete impact in people's lives. And I opened the book describing Idlib province in northwestern Syria, where the Syrians and the Russians were deliberately bombing civilian institutions, hospitals, schools, marketplaces, apartment buildings, and killing a significant number of the 3 million civilians who were in that province. And I describe how, in that case, it wasn't even possible to shame Assad. This is a guy who was largely beyond shame. But we knew that he needed Russian military support. And this was before Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin still cared about relations with the world, with Europe. And so we mounted a campaign for a couple of years focusing on former German Chancellor Merkel, French President Macron, and Turkish President Erdogan to get them to pressure Putin to stop the bombing. And in March 2020, he agreed and it stopped. And it stopped completely for 3 years. It picked up a little bit, but then Idlib is where HTS, the rebel group, came from in this past December to overthrow Assad. So basically it stopped definitively. Yeah. And that is something that meant that 3 million civilians were no longer living in fear of being killed, moment by moment from the sky. And it's things like that that are very heartening. You're making an enormous difference in people's lives.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of examples like that in the book that, we wouldn't have really known about until we get into the detail about the organisation. Just now, two things: donor-driven censorship and criticism of Israel. Anybody who's been following your career will be aware, and it's also detailed in the book, about Harvard Kennedy Law School's decision to deny you a fellowship. And I've also been reading a lot about it and your commentary around, I suppose, the critics about your criticism of Israel, and how you say that what they say is they don't want less criticism of Israel, they want none. What are the ramifications? But even not so much on a personal level, yes, on a personal level, but on a more far-reaching level in terms of what can be done to stop this type of censorship on academic freedom?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, first of all, the Harvard Kennedy School, which is actually a public policy school, it's separate from the law school, is, I had been offered tentatively a fellowship there to write this book. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a done deal, except I needed formal approval from the dean. And the dean vetoed the fellowship because of my criticism of Israel. Now, everybody assumed that it was fear of donor reaction. He says he didn't talk to any donors. He talked to people who mattered to him, which is probably just his fundraising department. But it was, I just think he was too clever by half, because I don't think there would have been a donor reaction. But in fact, there was a huge public reaction to his effort to censor criticism of Israel. And after 2 weeks of massive media exposure and protests among students and faculty and alumni, he reversed course. And I ended up getting the fellowship. But that was that one case. Obviously, more broadly, Trump right now is attacking universities to try to stop criticism of Israel, and is, withholding hundreds of millions of dollars of federal aid to pursue the censorship effort. Now, the courts are standing in, but there are certain areas where the courts can't stop him. I do think that, one thing that Trump illustrates, and this is, there's a broader problem here too, there's an increasing tendency to charge critics of Israel with anti-Semitism. And that really cheapens the very important concept of anti-Semitism, because if people think that, any charge of anti-Semitism is just a way to stop criticism of Israel, they're going to lose interest in anti-Semitism at a point where it actually is a serious problem affecting Jews around the world. And so, what is really going on here is that the people who do this are much more concerned with defending the Israeli government, and they're willing to sort of throw Jews around the world under the bus. And I think it's important to say that, because this is not helpful to Jews.
No. I mean, so much has been exposed. Well, looking ahead and in terms of global challenges, I mean, we've mentioned some cases there, and I mean, we're all bearing witness to utter turmoil at the moment. I mean, the death toll in Gaza is surely it's more than 60,000, because I know that there's been a recent finding from research conducted at Harvard with over 300,000 missing. So it's going to be much higher. We're looking at escalating crisis between perhaps Iran and Israel. Not sure if that's going to come to an end. Continuing war in Ukraine, Sudan, DRC, and I'm sure I'm missing so many others, but we are bearing witness to serious amounts of civilian casualties that are being reported on a daily basis. What, if anything, gives you hope for the global human rights movement at the moment?
Well, I mean, this is obviously a challenging moment. You're totally right about that. But, if you look at where people stand, they really believe in human rights. They believe in democracy. And ultimately, the strength of the movement relies on public opinion, because even dictatorships have to be sensitive to public opinion. They don't want to exist solely through coercion. They want a degree of public acquiescence in their role. And, people often talk about this global contest between autocracy and democracy. And if you look at the West, it looks like democracy's in trouble. We've had Trump, the AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, Nigel Farage in the UK. I mean, there are, these right-wing figures who are emerging, who are posing a threat to democracy. But if you look a bit more broadly, when people live under autocracy, they almost uniformly want out. And we've seen these huge demonstrations against autocracy for democracy in a country after country in recent years. And, sometimes it works. So, recently Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh was ousted after popular demonstrations. The Rajapaksa dynasty was ended in Sri Lanka. Bolsonaro was ousted in Brazil. the Law and Justice Party lost hold on the government in Poland. Recently, South Korea, popular uprising stopped a coup by the president. So sometimes this works. Other times, the repression is too severe. So, that's what happened in Iran with the women's movement there. That's Russia, Belarus, Uganda, Nicaragua. But even in those cases where the repression prevails for the time being, it's clear what the people want. And when governments are surviving simply by the barrel of a gun, that's a tenuous position to be in. I mean, look what happened to Assad, in Syria, where he was hated. And when this rebel group started marching toward Damascus, nobody stopped it. Yeah. Nobody defended Assad. He was so hated. So I just think that, the idea that government should be accountable to its people, the idea that people should have the right to express themselves, as well as the right to basic necessities, whether it's food or healthcare or housing, these are broadly sought by the people of the world. And that gives me hope, because that is the foundation on which the movement moves forward.
Good. I like that answer. It gives me hope as well. Well, just tied on to that, for young or aspiring lawyers and activists who are entering this space or contemplating entering this space, what advice would you offer to help them on their way?
Well, let me say two things. First is that there's a tendency for lawyers to think about litigation as the main way to get things done. And, when you live in, a rule of law state where the courts are strong, that's understandable. But what I describe in the book is an alternative legal method, something that supplements going to court. And it's important to keep that in mind, because if you can, clarify, document what a government is doing wrong and use public opinion to pressure the government to change, that's an important supplement to litigation. And I think lawyers should think about that as just one tool in their litigation or, advocacy arsenal. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would say is that, as I was mentioning, the foundation of the human rights movement is the public sense of right and wrong. And we all have a responsibility to reinforce that. It's not stagnant. It evolves. And so, people may say, well, what can I as an individual do? How can I make a difference? The truth is you can make a big difference because, you're influential with your friends, your colleagues at work, your family, your community. And speaking about these issues is the way you reinforce the public sense of right and wrong. And it only is going to stay solid if all of us join in to reinforce it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, as I mentioned, your book featured in our book club, the Activist Lawyer Book Club, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It was particularly interesting to me just to see, you've mentioned it already, the interactions between democracy and autocracy and that real understanding of power at work. The donor issue coming into play quite a lot in terms of, specific donors willing to donate to the organisation, but only if their chosen country was not going to be scrutinised for human rights abuses. So it's real power politics at play. But what do you hope readers will take away from the book? And do you think there's an appeal to those who might not necessarily be lawyers or indeed work in this area?
Oh, no, I deliberately wrote the book so it's not aimed at specialists. Yeah. It's aimed for the general public. I want people to understand that it's possible to move governments, and the tools that I describe, the techniques I describe toward governments also apply for other institutions. Yeah. It could be, your workplace. It could be your university. It could be, a hospital. I mean, any institution that purports to abide by certain moral standards is shameable when it falls short. And so I think that the strategies in the book are broadly applicable in life. It's not just about moving big governments.
Absolutely. Well, look, finally, our podcast, as you know, is called Activist Lawyer. And I'm wondering, in your view, how can law and activism come together? We ask many of our guests this in terms of making lasting and meaningful change in our society.
Well, Sarah, one point I make in the book is that, while there's always something you can do to put pressure on a government or an institution, there's always an angle that you can pursue. We also shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that just a quick win means the end of the story. Because, speaking here of governments, they are always tempted to violate human rights. They're always looking for a way to stick in power, to kind of suppress the opposition, whatever it is. And so the role of the defender of human rights is to always push back. This is not a task where you can go home and say mission accomplished. You've got to recognize that every day they're figuring out how they can kind of suppress the opposition. Every day you've got to wake up and see how you're going to stop them. And so we just have to accept that. It is a relentless activity, but it's essential that it happen because otherwise governments resort to their worst instincts.
Well, look, Kenneth Roth, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I personally thoroughly enjoyed your book and would highly recommend it to anybody listening. And again, appreciate all of your answers and for joining me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.